History as it happens, November 15th, 2024. We have met the enemy.
There are conflicting reports out of Afghanistan. Some say that Soviet forces now are in complete control.
Massive Soviet military forces have invaded the small, non-aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan.
Defeated by Afghan rebels armed by a secret CIA operation.
The United States has insisted on a settlement of the Afghan conflict that ensures the complete withdrawal of all Soviet troops.
The irony is that the Haqqani network was actually initially nurtured by the CIA, the very people who are now trying to chase down the leaders of the network.
There has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center.
As of yet unconfirmed that a plane has hit the World Trade Center
in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
The Haqqani network he founded is accused of planning this truck bombing in Kabul last year.
Taliban have rewarded family members of suicide bombers who attacked U.S. and Afghan troops.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has decided it should be declared a foreign terrorist organization.
I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan.
The leader of the Haqqani clan actually was one of the main fighters against the Soviet forces.
The name Haqqani is synonymous with jihad, to violent resistance of foreign invasion in Afghanistan, going back 40 years. Now, a Haqqani who topped the U.S. Most Wanted list is portraying himself as a statesman, going on diplomatic tours to legitimize Taliban rule. The CIA helped create the Haqqani network. Today, Washington calls them terrorists, as Afghanistan slips from view. That's next, as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
When they did want to have negotiations with the Taliban, they saw the Haqqani network as this sort of distinct group that was a terrorist group that was separate from the core Taliban, and it just demonstrates how little the U.S. understood about the way the Taliban worked and the cohesion there.
You know that quote by Faulkner, "The past is never dead, it's not even past"? He might have been talking about Afghanistan. Sirajuddin Haqqani is Afghanistan's acting Minister of Interior, but his formal title fails to convey his significance or that of his family name. In an article for the New York Times, reporter Christina Goldbaum describes him as Afghanistan's most wanted militant, a blood-soaked jihadist who inspired fear among ordinary Afghans, an angel of death with the power to determine who would live and who would die during the U.S.-led war, a ghost-like kingpin of global jihad with deep ties to al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks. He topped the U.S. Most Wanted list in Afghanistan with a $10 million bounty on his head. Now, most Americans would not recognize this man who now boasts that the Taliban defeated the United States. He rarely gives interviews.
You wrote then that I'm confident, and you said once this territory is liberated, we together will find a way to build an Islamic system in which all Afghans have equal rights, where the rights of women that are granted by Islam, from the right to education to the right to work, are protected, and where merit is the basis for equal opportunity. I want to know whether you still believe that.
The commitments that have been made. The situation at the time was a situation of war. The opposing parties have provided a very bad picture and definition of our administration.
But I recognized his name. His father, Jalaluddin Haqqani, fought the Soviet Union and was funded by the CIA during the 1980s. As Steve Call writes in Ghost Wars, his 2005 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Haqqani was seen by CIA officers in Islamabad and others as perhaps the most impressive Pashtun battlefield commander in the war. He sponsored some of the first Arab fighters who faced Soviet forces in 1987. He had been wounded in battle, in one case holding out in a cave under heavy assault for weeks. He later recovered in Saudi Arabia's best hospitals and made many connections among the kingdom's wealthy sheiks at the annual Hajj pilgrimage, as well as through General Intelligence Department introductions. That would be Saudi intelligence. Haqqani was so favored with supplies that he was in a position to broker them and to help equip the Arab volunteers gathering in his region of Afghanistan. The CIA officers working from Islamabad regarded him as a proven commander who could put a lot of men under arms at short notice. Haqqani had the CIA's full support. Needless to say, his son Sirajuddin does not have the CIA's support today. The son did try to forge ties with U.S. officials during the American invasion, but he was rebuffed. He is being welcomed now to other foreign capitals. The story of the Haqqanis and their jihadist network is why Afghanistan is so fascinating. The patterns of invasion, defeat, allies becoming enemies. Made me think of this radio address delivered by President Ronald Reagan in 1985, when U.S. support for the anti-Soviet jihad seemed like the right idea.
And in the face of this brutal onslaught, the Afghan people still refuse to surrender is surely a miracle. And in this holiday season of renewed faith in miracles, it is surely fitting for us to honor and pray for those brave men and women. These courageous people have shown the world that the Soviets can never achieve the outright subjugation of the Afghan mind and spirit that they seek. The Afghan people are too proud, too fiercely determined to fight on. The Soviets understand this. They know that in a sense the battle for Afghanistan has shifted from the mountains of Afghanistan itself to the wider field of world opinion. So it is that the Soviets are prolonging the war and blacking out news about the daily atrocities which they're committing. They are waiting for world attention to slip, for our outrage to wane. Then they believe the support which the free world has been providing to the freedom fighters will dwindle. The Soviets at that point will have effectively cut off the freedom fighters' lifelines, and although the Mujahideen may never surrender, the Soviets will have achieved indisputable control of the country. An entire nation will have been strangled. My friends, in the name of human freedom, we cannot, we must not allow that to happen.
So who is Sirajuddin Haqqani? Why is this notorious terrorist visiting Russia and China? Will the U.S. ever recognize him or the Taliban as the sovereign government of Afghanistan? Adam Weinstein is the Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's a Marine veteran who was deployed in Uruzgan province at the tail end of the Obama surge in 2012. Adam Weinstein, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
It's been a couple years. You know, Afghanistan, after the 2021 withdrawal, faded some from the headlines. Not entirely. It became a political issue. But I think most Americans don't think about Afghanistan very much. They weren't thinking about Afghanistan very much before the chaotic and bloody withdrawal. But we're going to think about it now because I spotted an article by Christina Goldbaum for the New York Times about what's happening in the country now, because it is important. It was a profile of Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is the son of an old Mujahideen warlord. Let's talk about his family and the old Haqqani network. Why is his last name so important as we think about 40 years of war in Afghanistan?
You know, one thing to remember is that there is the family of the Haqqanis, such as Sirajuddin, Anas, Jalaluddin Haqqani. There's the family, but the honorific, or Haqqani itself is an honorific. It's a title that comes from a seminary in Pakistan where many Taliban were educated, Dar-ul Ulum Haqqaniya. There's members of the Haqqani network who are not necessarily related, but they were graduates of that seminary, and so they became part of the Haqqani network. And the Haqqanis were known to be quite effective insurgents. They incorporated the use of suicide bombers, which was not quite as common. And they're a little bit distinct from the core Taliban movement in that if you think about the core Taliban movement, they were from the southern Pashtun provinces of Afghanistan, like Helmand, Kandahar, Uruzgan, those places, whereas the Haqqanis had their stronghold more in the east. And they used to be viewed for a long time as separate from the Taliban. So there was the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network, but it's become quite clear that they're part and parcel of the Taliban, even though they have their own networks and their own allegiances, and they're thought to be a bit closer to al-Qaeda than the core Taliban are. And they were also thought to be closer to the Pakistanis and the ISI than the core Taliban were. They have their roots in the anti-Soviet jihad of the 1980s. And then after the U.S. invasion in 2001, they started back up.
What I always find so fascinating about Afghanistan is the names repeat and the patterns repeat. The U.S. goes from supporting people to being at war with them and then having to work with them again. And the premise of the article was how the Haqqanis have reached out to Western leaders and the United States over the years, over the past 20 years of the U.S. war after 9/11, and were rebuffed. And Christina Goldbaum mentions how the American war on terrorism created the very enemies it sought to destroy. And we're talking post-2001. We go back to the anti-Soviet jihad in the 1980s. I have Steve Call's book here, Ghost Wars. He's talking about Haqqani, the father. Cole writes, the CIA's leadership continued to regard Pakistani intelligence as the jihad's main implementing agency, even as more and more American trainers arrived in Pakistan to teach new weapons and techniques. All this ensured that the ISI, which is Pakistan intelligence, their Muslim Brotherhood-inspired clients won the greatest share of support. And again, that included, along the Pakistan border, Haqqani, the father. Cole goes on to write that eventually the CIA is becoming more and more uncomfortable with the people the Haqqanis were working with. Those were the so-called Afghan Arabs, people like Osama bin Laden. So while it's true that the CIA never directly worked with bin Laden, the CIA gave money to the Pakistanis, who then distributed that aid, weapons, etc., to their chosen jihadists in Afghanistan, who are working with people like Osama bin Laden. You want to try to untangle some of these patterns and ironies and, I guess, the craziness of all of this?
At the time, the Soviet Union was the principal threat to the United States, or at least that was the perception in Washington. And so it was expedient to work with anyone who opposed the Soviets. And the Mujahideen were more than happy to accept U.S. support. And of course, the Mujahideen is a blanket term. There were different factions within the Mujahideen, but they were Afghan fighters who were opposing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis and the ISI in particular worked with different factions. And of course, we funneled weapons to them. And then, like any jihad, you saw the same thing unfold in Syria. It attracted transnational jihadis. And, you know, if you were a jihadi in the 1980s, I mean, the place to be was Afghanistan. That's where you could get in the fight. And so it did attract folks like bin Laden and people who are sometimes referred to as Afghan Arabs. And of course, the Mujahideen were more than happy to welcome them as brothers and people who could give them technical skills, help them wage a more effective jihad against the Soviets. And so that's what happened. And when people refer to these groups as Muslim Brotherhood inspired, I mean, that sometimes gets exaggerated. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is a Islamist political movement that developed in the 20th century in Egypt and spread to places like Syria, and it's inspired groups like Hamas. But al-Qaeda is a sort of Salafi jihadi movement more than a Muslim Brotherhood movement. It has some inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Muslim Brotherhood are less extreme and more willing to work within the system. Now, the Taliban themselves are Deobandis. Deobandism is a subsect of Islam, of Sunni Islam, that developed in northern India as a response to British colonialism. And although Deobandis can be jihadists, it's not necessarily jihadist. The Taliban are a unique blend of Deobandism in which they've adopted elements of Salafi Islam. They've adopted some of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, and they've adopted some of this sort of Salafi jihadi understanding where, you know, jihad is incumbent. The Taliban basically have this sort of syncretic understanding of Islam that combines certain Pashtun tribal customs, elements of Salafism, even though they're not Salafi themselves, elements of this sort of al-Qaeda-esque jihadi understanding of Islam, and they've combined it into their own ideology. So out of that Mujahideen movement grows the Taliban. Those early links with the Arab world existed due to the Arab fighters that were flowing into Afghanistan, and the CIA couldn't do much about it.
I'll just cite Steve Call one more time here. Because throughout 1989, the CIA was pumping more arms, money, food, humanitarian supplies into the border regions where the so-called Afghan Arabs were building up their strength. And they also encouraged Saudi intelligence to do the same. Call says at the center of the border nexus stood Haqqani the father, Jalaluddin Haqqani, the long-bearded, fearless Afghan rebel commander with strong Islamist beliefs who had grown very close to Pakistani and Saudi intelligence during the last years of the anti-Soviet war. And 1989 was the last year. Haqqani operated south of Parrot's Peak, near bin Laden's territory. He was seen by CIA officers in Islamabad and others as perhaps the most impressive Pashtun battlefield commander in the war. And Adam, all those nuances and complexities that you mentioned there about the different strands of Islam, etc., I'm not sure the CIA was all that interested in understanding this. To them, it was defeat the Soviets, not thinking long-term about the life they were breathing into the people that the United States would eventually, years later, be at war with, including Haqqani the son.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, Washington tends not to be great at second order thinking at times. They prioritize the immediate threat and they don't think about the consequences of certain strategies. That being said, look, an argument could be made, a rational argument could be made that it made sense to oppose the Soviets in Afghanistan, even if you had to work with less than desirable partners. I think the real mistake the U.S. made was giving that support and then disengaging completely during the 1990s from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we're at risk of making that mistake again, by the way. It's this sort of, hyper focus followed by disengagement and then not seeing what's happening on the ground and severing those relationships.
Well, George H.W. Bush, president at the time of the Soviet withdrawal in '89, made some remarks to reporters in the White House where he promised the United States would not abandon Afghanistan.
We support the Afghan efforts to fashion a stable, broadly based government responsive to the needs of the Afghan people. Throughout the long, dark years of Afghanistan's occupation, the international community has been steadfast in its support of the Afghan cause, and this certainly has been true for the United States. Our commitment, the commitment of the United States to the people there, will remain, and will remain firm, both through our bilateral humanitarian aid program and through United Nations efforts to remove the mines and resettle the refugees and help reconstruct the war-torn economy. So we would call upon the Soviet Union to refrain from other forms of interference in Afghan affairs. The Soviet Union has nothing to fear from the establishment of an independent, non-aligned Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, the United States has a long history of abandoning Afghanistan and also abandoning other places where it wages war. So we're not good at keeping our promises. And unfortunately, no president can really make a credible promise because the next administration can change the policy.
And it was a very difficult country as well. Now that we've covered the origins of the Haqqani network, I do want to leap ahead now to the 1990s. When the Soviets leave, the regime, such as it was in Kabul, is holding on for dear life because now you have all these factions of Mujahideen and Afghan Arabs, and a civil war erupts in Afghanistan. What was the status of the Haqqani network during the civil war? The Taliban eventually prevail in 1996 and they take over the country. The Haqqanis eventually align themselves with the Taliban, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, during the Civil War, essentially what happened with the Taliban is they became a group that was led by then Mullah Omar, their founder, that essentially was resisting the excesses of local warlords. So in the folklore of the Taliban, there was a local warlord who had abused a young woman and they caught the individual and they killed him. So this is the kind of folklore of the Taliban. It does seem that some of it is true and that the Taliban were good at administering quick justice in these remote tribal areas. The local warlords and the bigger warlords that had controlled different Mujahideen factions were abusing the population during the civil war. I mean, it was an absolutely brutal civil war. And of course, the Haqqanis did align with the Taliban. But the Taliban had started more as sort of a vigilante group that was administering quick justice. And then it expanded into this broader movement that was eventually able to march on Kabul and take over the country and establish an emirate from 1996 to 2001. And Mullah Omar was, by all accounts, a very simple person. It doesn't seem like he always had these ambitions to lead Afghanistan, but it was his simplicity and, or at least perceived authenticity and his, by Taliban standards, good character that made him a credible leader.
He wasn't in it for the money, that's right. So no. An important part of this story is Sirajuddin Haqqani's upbringing. So he is the key Taliban figure. He's not the sheikh. He is not in charge of Afghanistan today, but he's a key Taliban figure who's now been reaching out to Western governments today. But he was born in around 1979. It's not exactly clear when he was born, but around 79, the year of the Soviet invasion. And he was brought up in this environment. There was so much displacement in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion that a lot of young people like Sirajuddin, they were driven into the border regions or even into Pakistan, and they were educated in madrasas that were set up by Pakistan's leader at the time, these were the schools, right? Weren't these the schools where the future Taliban received their religious education while their fathers were fighting the Soviets? And can you talk a little bit about how that shaped Sirajuddin's outlook and his politics?
Well, yeah. So Sirajuddin grows up essentially as a refugee in Miranshah in North Waziristan, which is still quite a troubled area today. And then before the U.S. invasion, returns to Khost in Afghanistan, and he receives a religious education. And there's a madrasa network across Pakistan. Perhaps the one most synonymous with the Taliban is the one I mentioned, Dar-ul-Uloom Haqqani, and it's not even that far from Islamabad. It's like an hour and a half drive. Maybe less than that. I've passed it myself on the road, and you can say I've never gone inside. But there were other madrasas or even madrasas in Karachi that Taliban studied at. I mentioned before that the Taliban are a Deobandi-oriented group. The majority of Pakistani Muslims are actually more Sufi-oriented. They're Barelvis. We don't have to get into the details of that. But Deobandis dominate the madrasas. And of course, during the anti-Soviet jihad, Gulf money also poured into these madrasas, and they educated young people with religious education, but there was also an emphasis on jihad. And jihad, not just this sort of internal jihad that some people will say there's a greater jihad, which is the jihad against your own inner demons, but the physical jihad, not just a defensive physical jihad, but this idea that you had to go seek jihad. Sirajuddin grows up in that environment. He grows up seeing his father being part of the anti-Soviet jihad. And then when the U.S. invasion happens, it's his turn, and he's ready to participate in it and excited to participate in it.
Yes, and he was described by Christina Goldbaum. To many, Mr. Haqqani was a boogeyman. I love how the New York Times still uses the Mr. Mr. Haqqani was a boogeyman, an angel of death with the power to determine who would live and who would die during the U.S.-led war after 2001. He deployed his ranks of Taliban suicide bombers who rained carnage on American troops and Afghan civilians alike. A ghost-like kingpin of global jihad, she writes, with deep ties to al-Qaeda and other terrorist networks. He topped the United States' most wanted list in Afghanistan with a $10 million bounty on his head. And of course, as we've discussed, his father was very close to bin Laden.
We've just held a very useful, I might say brief, but also I'll add a very moving discussion with Chairman Yunus Khalis of the Islamic Union of Mujahideen of Afghanistan and other members of his distinguished delegation. I expressed our nation's continued strong support for the resistance and our satisfaction with the large step the Afghan resistance took toward unity in choosing a chairman for the first time. This new political milestone demonstrates that the people of Afghanistan speak with one voice in their opposition to the Soviet invasion and occupation of their homeland. This increasing unity has already made itself felt on the battlefield. During the past 18 months, the Mujahideen fighting inside the country have improved their weapons, tactics, and coordination. The result has been a string of serious defeats for the Soviet elite units, as well as many divisions from the Kabul army. Chairman Khalis and his delegation are visiting Washington following the November 10th UN General Assembly vote, which, with a record vote once again, called overwhelmingly for the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Afghanistan.
What do you make of the reports that at several points during the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan, the Haqqanis sought rapprochement with the United States, but all these efforts were rebuffed?
I've read that in reporting, and I've heard that from people who are familiar with the issue directly, and it's largely understood that happened. And I think it just speaks to the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan that for a long time, didn't want to have negotiations with the Taliban, or when they did want to have negotiations with the Taliban, they saw the Haqqani network as this sort of distinct group that was a terrorist group that was separate from the core Taliban. And it just demonstrates how little the U.S. understood about the way the Taliban worked and the cohesion there. Yes, there are different factions within the Afghan Taliban, but they were still working together. The Haqqanis were very effective insurgents, very effective terrorists. They were willing to used suicide bombers, and they were willing to deploy IEDs, and they were responsible for plenty of deaths of U.S. service members and plenty of Afghan deaths as well.
That probably answers the question. The U.S. didn't want to deal with somebody who was killing U.S. soldiers and causing havoc in the country. But the other side of that argument is by not even, attempting to speak, it just prolonged the war. Apparently, the Haqqani sent a convoy of emissaries to Kabul to meet Americans there, but it was hit with an airstrike before it even got there. So
there's a repetitive debate about whether the U.S. could have worked with, I don't even want to use the word moderate, I'll use the word pragmatic Taliban after the invasion. There was outreach from different Taliban. There were some Taliban who claimed that, and of course this is what Sirajuddin is saying, that they wanted to basically have reconciliation and they would have been willing to work within this system. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I'm a little bit dubious that the Taliban truly would have been willing to work within the system of the Republic. But there might have been a sort of political order that emerged after 2001 that wasn't the Republic that we saw, but was something perhaps between the Republic and what we see today with the renewed emirate, and something more sustainable. They might have been willing to negotiate, and they had a much smaller hand to work with at that time, and perhaps we could have gotten more concessions out of them. I think at the end of the day, the Taliban have maximalist aims, just like the US had maximalist aims, and they would have used any compromise to seek complete power the same way they use the Doha process to gain complete power. But it would have saved a lot of bloodshed, and we would have seen, I don't think anything worse than what's emerged today would have happened. That was a missed opportunity. But I don't think that they were willing to just become Democrats within the Republic system either.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything as like a moderate Taliban, but I think pragmatic is more to it, or maybe even opportunistic. So Sirajuddin is now acting as a diplomat. He's at odds with the leader of the Taliban, Sheikh Habibatullah Akhundzada, who is a hardliner anti-women's rights, and that is the number one issue apparently holding up any formal recognition of Afghanistan's government at the UN and other countries. But Sirajuddin Haqqani apparently wants girls to be able to go back to school past 6th grade, and he's been making the rounds, establishing relationship with some former enemies in Europe, as well as Russia and China. Why are foreign countries, namely Russia, China, others, welcoming Taliban diplomats?
They're welcoming Taliban diplomats because they can, and they don't have the same restrictions that the U.S. has. They don't have the same bureaucratic restrictions and legal restrictions. And I'll give you an example. Xi Jinping personally received the Taliban's ambassador to China in January of this year and received his credentials. Now, if you ask the Chinese, have they offered formal recognition to the Taliban, they'll say no. But yet they still receive a Taliban ambassador and give him the respect that they would give anyone else. And that's really what the Taliban want. See, the Taliban don't need the legitimacy of a US-led order that they feel they defeated. And by the way, they feel they defeated with God's support. So they really don't need our legitimacy. What they want is respect. And so countries like China and Russia are able to give them that respect without formally recognizing them. And so there's some semantics at play right now, because there's this de facto recognition that's occurring, and they don't have de jure recognition. But I don't really think they care that much about legal recognition, certainly not Washington's legal recognition. But of course, the U.S. can't do things like that. We can't host a Taliban ambassador and receive his credentials and then also say, well, it doesn't count as recognition. A country like China is able to be flexible like that in its diplomacy and in its optics, and it doesn't have an Afghan diaspora or an entire generation of war vets who are going to write to Xi Jinping and political representatives and say, how could this possibly happen? Because, they have the benefit of that, which makes it easier to pull stunts like this. And then you have regional countries like Pakistan, Uzbekistan, that just have to work with the Taliban because it's their neighbors. And it's actually, Afghanistan is a neighbor of China as well. We have to remember that. But even countries like India are taking a more pragmatic approach. They sent a technical team to their former embassy in Afghanistan, and they've taken a more pragmatic approach towards the Taliban. So you see a difference. Whereas the U.S. and Western Europe, especially, most of the former allies and that were part of ISAF and the war in Afghanistan, they are taking supposedly a more values-based approach where we say, well, we're not going to engage with you fully if you don't restore women's rights and so forth. But the reality is we just don't have all that much leverage. Now, the U.S. remains the biggest donor of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. That's a fact, and in some cases that's leverage. But I think the Taliban know that the U.S. is providing that aid for other reasons. Even that doesn't provide much leverage.
And it's not clear how much leverage Haqqani himself has to restore women's rights when the Sheikh, Akhundzada, is ardently opposed. Adam, for as long as I can remember, Afghanistan has been a battlefield, a geopolitical battlefield during the Cold War, and then this far-off distant place that was scarred by war and ruled by these austere, medieval fanatics, the Taliban in the 1990s. And then after 2001, it went back to being a battlefield that was important to the United States in a security sense. You know, our security at home depends on being able to defeat these people in this far-off, very difficult country when it comes to terrain and our understanding of the people there. But these foreign countries, I'll eventually get around to my question here, like Russia, China, they see Afghanistan as important for different reasons, right? Now, I'll cite a quote from an Afghan women's rights activist, Mahbouba Siraj. She was interviewed by First Post just the other day. She gave her take on China, Russia, and other foreign actors' growing ties with the Taliban. She said, China is not interested in the people of Afghanistan, but what is below the ground. What do you think of that?
I think that's true. I mean, China has always had interest in extracting resources and mining in Afghanistan. Now, it hasn't been able to really fully pursue those interests because the infrastructure didn't exist, although it's trying to now. I would argue that, China, Russia, Pakistan, all of Afghanistan's neighbors, their primary focus is security. But that's actually the U.S. and Europe's primary focus as well. I mean, if you really get down to it with U.S. and European policymakers, what they're concerned about is ISKP, so Islamic State Khorasan province, the Islamic State branch in Afghanistan, and they're also concerned about al-Qaeda. Now, they'll say they're concerned about women's rights, and I think that's genuine to an extent, but it's a secondary issue at the end of the day. It's just that the war in Afghanistan and Europe was largely justified to the general public on human rights grounds, so they have to be accountable to that. Now, that was less the case in the U.S. It was originally sold as a response to 9/11, and that's what it was. But over time, the justifications for the war evolved, and you had this idea that we were supporting women's rights, and we were supporting women's rights. I mean, maternal mortality rates went way down due to U.S. investment in Afghanistan. Women did have de jure rights. Women did have the right to vote. There were women in government. There were women police. There were women judges. That shouldn't be dismissed. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the main focus is still security. And something about education, because it's complicated. I remember when I came back from Afghanistan, people would ask me, for my deployment, people would ask me sort of wistfully, like, oh, could the girls read? And I would say, well, I didn't interact with the girls, but I can tell you that the boys couldn't read. So in rural Afghanistan, there was always a sort of lack of opportunity and lack of education that in some ways transcended gender. Now, of course, in the provincial capitals and in the cities, girls were going to school, girls were becoming educated, women were going to university, and that was quite significant. But there were two Afghanistans that existed. You know, when we look at education of younger girls, in some ways, the cessation of conflict has allowed them to go to school more easily because they don't have to worry about getting caught in the crossfire of combat. But yes, they can't go beyond 6th grade. Now, I believe Sirajuddin when he says that he wants to allow girls to go to school. What Sirajuddin envisions for education for girls beyond 6th grade is probably quite different than what the international community envisions. But we do have to remember that some of the senior Taliban actually do send their daughters to higher education. None of them are willing to break with the emir over this issue. It is a cohesive movement. I mean, journalists love to talk about infighting. I remember after the Taliban took over, there was all this talk about gunfights breaking out between Mullah Baradar and the Haqqanis and this and that. I don't believe any of it. They're a cohesive movement. Yes, they might get frustrated with the emir. They might challenge the emir a little bit. But the reason they are in charge today is because they were unified and they were cohesive, and the Republic was not.
And Sirajuddin's attempts at approaching other countries has gotten him into a little bit of trouble with the Sheikh, and the Sheikh seems to be winning that battle. As you say, this is a cohesive movement. You started to answer my next question. I was wondering what Sirajuddin is actually after here. You said he doesn't really need or want U.S. recognition. But from other countries, is it foreign investment? There has to be something that he's after, unless he's just trying to do this to win a power struggle against the sheikh.
He probably does understand, perhaps better than the reclusive emir and the clerics who surround him. I think Sirajuddin probably understands a little bit better that a completely isolated Afghanistan can't function economically. And ultimately, if they can function economically, there's going to be resistance from within. And,
exactly. I mean, they're in a huge hole right now. So he is looking at this pragmatically.
Yeah, I think he's pragmatic. Now, I really dispute these ideas that he's trying to set himself up to sort of, I don't know, stage a coup against the emir or anything like that. But the fact is that Sirajuddin is younger than the emir. I mean, the emir will die someday. There will be another emir. And Sirajuddin might be setting himself up to be the next one. And this is something that U.S. policymakers and European policymakers should really think about. Are they making the inroads within the movement that would allow them to capitalize off of the death of the emir? You know, stop thinking about trying to foment infighting within the Taliban. We don't understand the Taliban. Let's just admit that. We don't understand the Taliban. But people die. They die of natural causes. They die of heart attacks, and there will be another emir. And are we taking the steps today that would set ourselves up to take advantage of that moment? Or would we be just caught by surprise and we haven't invested in these relationships, and it's countries like China are going to take advantage of it?
So let's talk about Biden, the outgoing administration, and the incoming administration of Donald Trump. You pointed out something, an item that was pretty much overlooked during our election hysteria here in the U.S. Tom West, who was the special representative for Afghanistan, is now transitioning to a new role at the State Department, acting head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination. West worked tirelessly, quoting a State Department press release, he worked tirelessly to ensure both our national interests and the welfare of the Afghan people, guided our policy in the country. Working with allies and partners, the U.S. has helped lead a robust humanitarian effort that prevented a wider famine and met the urgent needs of millions of Afghans. And that is probably true, but what is the significance of West transitioning out of this role?
I'm sure the significance for him is that it's a good career move, because it's a completely thankless position to have. It's an impossible role. Because he had to be accountable to the veteran community, the Afghan diaspora, which is very anti-Taliban, of course. He had to be accountable to former Republic stakeholders. He was dealing with the Taliban out of Doha. He was dealing with all the other special representatives from different countries in the region, especially. And so there were so many stakeholders, and it was his mandate was limited in terms of what he was permitted to do. And he was a different kind of special representative than, for example, Khalilzad was. Khalilzad spoke Pashto. Khalilzad was originally an Afghan. Khalilzad had a strong personal relationship with Hamid Karzai. Khalilzad was able to negotiate the Doha agreement with Mullah Baradar from the Taliban because they could do it in Pashto and they understood each other. Whereas you look at someone like West, and he was more of a technocrat, and so the diplomacy took on a sort of technocratic flavor to it. And I don't know that that necessarily works well with the Taliban, but like he was in an impossible situation where he was being accountable to all these different stakeholders in a way that I think was difficult to achieve things. What does it mean for the position ending? It means that I think the U.S. is disengaging even more from Afghanistan. But what I would point out is that it's an opportunity, because we still can run things out of Doha. We have the Afghanistan Affairs Unit in Doha that can conduct direct outreach with the Taliban and is actually much more removed from the public spotlight. And that can actually be an opportunity. When you're conducting diplomacy with a group like the Taliban, you don't necessarily want to be in the headlines. You might want to do it more under the table so you don't have to deal with all this backlash. So I think there are opportunities there, but I guess we're going to see what happens. And under the Trump administration, who knows?
I was going to ask you, it's hard to say how important Afghanistan will be to the incoming Trump administration. His early picks when it comes to national security and the military seem to be more hawkish, but there are people who may also be hesitant to want to, well, get involved in combat again in Afghanistan, because there is an argument out there especially among people who thought it was wrong to withdraw in 2021, that the United States needs to have a presence in the country to prevent more terrorist attacks. By the way, Sirajuddin has said, he said it in the New York Times interview, that the Taliban is capable of preventing that from happening. He actually said there were no international jihadists in Afghanistan anymore, which is not really believable. But yeah, I guess we don't really know where this is all going.
Well, there's plenty of international jihadists inside Afghanistan. I mean, there's the TTP, which is the so-called Pakistani Taliban. There's ISKP, which of course the Taliban are fighting and fairly effectively, but there's limits to what they can do. There's al-Qaeda inside, Uyghur militants who are inside Afghanistan as well, and others. I mean, the notion that there's no terrorists inside Afghanistan is laughable. But I do think when it comes to common enemies like ISKP, the Taliban can be, maybe we shouldn't use the word partners, but there can be a parallel effort. Think about the parallel effort that existed against ISIS from Iran-aligned militias. I mean, sometimes there's these parallel efforts, and they're not partnerships, but they're working against a common enemy. And that could exist. I mean, I would say that diplomacy should be conducted inside Afghanistan for the reason that it lowers the cost of diplomacy, and that when you don't have normalized relations with a country, and so to deal with any problem, such as the U.S. hostages that the Taliban have, you have to arrange a meeting, and that in itself becomes a concession. That raises the cost of diplomacy. Whereas if you're already inside Afghanistan, there's a lower transactional cost to that diplomacy. You're not actually giving a concession by meeting with them because you're already there. The Taliban are ideologues. It doesn't mean they're not capable of hypocrisy, and it doesn't mean that they don't lie or engage in doublespeak, but they do have certain values. One example is one of the reasons they won't expel al-Qaeda is because they view al-Qaeda as guests, and they genuinely view them as guests, and that they're responsible for al-Qaeda. And I think if we were to have a formal diplomatic presence in Afghanistan, they might view the U.S. as guests. And so the way they treat U.S. hostages, or the way they treat dual nationals who are Afghan and U.S. or Afghan origin, and now they have U.S. citizenship, I think it would reduce the risks to those people, because all of a sudden they owe the U.S. something, because now the U.S. is a guest in their country, an invited guest at that. And so we could actually leverage the Taliban's own unique value system for our benefit.
The U.S. was never going to get anywhere as long as it was looked at as a foreign invader, and not just by the Taliban, a foreign occupier by ordinary people there. So last question. I think some people listening to this might say, I don't want to see ordinary Afghans suffer. I don't want to see famine. But there are a lot of countries in turmoil right now. And what is the U.S. interest here? What does it matter what happens in Afghanistan? Why are we even talking about this? Why do we care? I mean, I kind of answered my own question, because we don't want to see famine. We don't want to see the country fall to pieces, because that could affect other countries in the region. We don't want to see regional instability. But how would you respond to someone who says, I just don't care about Afghanistan anymore?
Look, there's an argument that can be made for that. We don't talk about Sudan at all. And that's arguably one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes that's happening in the world right now.
I did do a podcast about Sudan recently, but I agree. People in general are not thinking about Sudan.
Well, I mean, that's what's unique about your podcast is that you do try to focus on these issues that have fallen off the radar. So thank you for that. But I think in some sense we do have somewhat of a moral obligation to Afghanistan, because we meddled with the country for 40 years and spent the last 20 years directly involved. But I don't think that moral obligations should dictate foreign policy. I think hard interests and realpolitik should dictate foreign policy. And of course, a U.S. president's first obligation is to the American people. But for that reason, we have to stay engaged, because Afghanistan does present a security threat. Is it a major security threat? No. A medium level security threat that could emerge from Afghanistan. We do owe the former interpreters something in terms of getting them out. And we really have to learn as a country, how do we engage in these post-conflict states in a way that's productive? Places like Iraq, places like Afghanistan that were once our primary focus and now have fallen more off the radar. We need to find a middle ground. Our foreign policy in these conflicted areas cannot either be full-scale intervention or completely leaving and disengaging. We have to find a middle ground. And I think Afghanistan presents an opportunity for us to test that out and see if we can pull that off. And we just don't know. When we disengaged from Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 1990s, nobody predicted that 9/11 was going to happen. Nobody predicted that the Afghan government was going to collapse in a couple weeks. Obviously, we're not very good at predictions. So for that reason alone, we should remain engaged in Afghanistan, because we just don't know what is going to happen. So do I think it should be at the top of the stack of papers on the president's desk? No, it never should have been. That was a travesty. There are much more pressing issues. But it belongs on the desk, at least. And they should make sure that they should empower the State Department to conduct real diplomacy with the Taliban, probably inside Afghanistan, just like our UK and EU counterparts do.
We will conclude our military withdrawal. We will end America's longest war after 20 long years of bloodshed. The events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires. What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. We have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, Oblivion in the Age of Trump. Remember, new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. You can sign up by going to Substack and search for History as It Happens.